Thank you very much, Chair. Director, you're an eminent lawyer who's been involved in the criminal justice system, but I found your evidence particularly unconvincing, to say the least, on what we're talking about. I practiced in the criminal courts for 16 years, and essentially what you've told us that during that period of time, and when the Chair practiced in the courts, that the process for both investigating and prosecuting cases of this type was completely deficient, and that your predecessors clearly were not directing matters in an appropriate way. If I just, Ms. Belk asked a very fair question to you about how you measure success, and rather than members of this committee hearing about yet another strategy, which seems to me just to be plainly obvious what the prosecuting authorities should be doing, I think the public would be staggered to know that fewer than 1 in 60 rape cases reported to the police last year resulted in the suspect being charged. So that's 52,210 rapes being recorded in 2020 by the police in England and Wales, and only 843 resulted in a charge or a summons, a rate of 1.6%. I consider that to be shameful, utterly shameful. And if the only answer that our prosecuting authorities have is we need to build stronger cases, and we need to, I mean, we're talking for the first time right across the system. I mean, the comments that you've made are damning to the extent of, as you can say, I'm rather lost for words. So can I ask you this? The figure of 1.6% is there. In terms of the strategies and the various things that you are going to put in place, and we speak to you next year or the year after, what will that percentage be?
Well, I'm not going to predict a percentage, but I accept the challenge, and I say that we all need to be equal to it. Let me just deal with the figures that you presented. And you're right, 52,000 reports of rape. The figure you didn't mention, though, is that of that 52,000, only 2,700 were referred to the Crown Prosecution Service. So something I talk about often, namely the attrition rate, is far, far too high. And at this stage, what I mean by that is those who are brave enough, and let's be clear here, it's mostly women, those women who are brave enough, notwithstanding the trauma, to come forward and to tell the police what's happened, it is only in a very small percentage of those cases that it even reaches the Crown Prosecution Service. So something's going wrong at a very early stage. I believe there are multiple reasons for that, and I'm speaking to you at the tail end of a pandemic in which we now have a criminal justice system by volume of cases in the system which is facing a challenge that none of us have ever faced before, and I'm sure that many people looking, as it were, at the front door of the system are wondering, how will my case find its way through? How long am I going to have to wait? And those are legitimate questions. But all of the strategies that I've set out and the detail that I set out in answer to Ms. Barker under that strategy stands. I won't repeat it. But that is designed to properly increase the volume of cases that we get to consider, and to make sure that in considering them, we apply the right standards and we charge whenever we find that the code test is satisfied. So that's why I maintain my previous answer, that if we show sufficient determination, I believe the figures will change. But I'm not here to predict a precise percentage or number.
And therefore, what you leave us with, Director, is a comment that essentially, and you phrase this in whichever way you think is appropriate, that the level of cases and how they are investigated by the police are not being dealt with in a sufficiently competent or professional manner to come through in volume to be representative of the very many victims in this country who are not being served by the justice system.
Well, I said at the outset, and I repeat, that not enough of these people are being given their day in court, and that needs determination to change it. But let's be clear here, there have been some step changes introduced very recently. In fact, at the beginning of this year, the Attorney General produced new guidelines on disclosure, which came into force on the 31st of December. On the same day, I published what's known as the Director's Guidance on Charging, the 6th edition. Those documents are designed, both of them, to make all of us who operate in this arena look hard and look early at these cases and build them from the outset. And that is where change will come from. This is not about me saying it's all for the police, nor is it about the police saying it's all for the CPS. We have to work together and communicate at an earlier stage. And if that hasn't been happening sufficiently in the past, well, that is what needs to change. I mean, I will stop there. I'm sure there are other reasons why, if, as you say, it hasn't happened in the past.
Well, no, you said that, Director. Just one final very brief point. How many suspects are currently, if you don't have this figure, then perhaps you could provide it to the committee, how many suspects are currently released under investigation, having been arrested for an offence of rape?
I don't have the figure for that, and I'm happy, Chair, to provide it in writing. But let me just say this. It's not for me to comment on the Courts bill, but I do commend legislative efforts to ensure that as many cases as possible are brought within the Bail Act provisions. In other words, not subject to release under investigation. And it's probably not right for me to go any further, but one way of applying pressure on the system, and I'm here to say we need to apply that pressure to ourselves, is to hold these cases to a tighter timeline, and that is by releasing on bail, which is always with a designated date. I need hardly tell a qualified solicitor that, rather than an open-ended release under investigation. So if through whatever changes we see much fewer cases released under investigation and tighter control from the earliest stages, I would say that's a good thing.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks. I'm just following up on today's point. The 50,000 that don't get to the CPS, essentially a decision has been taken by the police
yes.
that there's not adequate evidence to submit the file to the Crown Prosecution Service is the long and short of it, isn't it?
That's absolutely right. And whether we're talking about my guidance on charging or the Attorney General's guidelines on disclosure, there are going to be cases where it is right for the police to decide, for whatever reason, that they cannot take the case forward. It is not a provable allegation. And that will always be a matter for police judgment. But there are many other cases where, through reaching out to the CPS for what we call early investigative advice, we can then apply minds to that case. Yeah. We will take what's known as an offender-centric approach to that. In other words, rather than just scrutinising the account given by the complainant, looking at the activity of the suspect before, during and after the offence to see whether that generates evidence which will bolster the case, and that is how you bring these cases forward. And I won't go on, but we have regional pilot work, as do police colleagues around the country, which is designed to bank these various changes in terms of strategy documents and working plans, and to work locally, and that's the key to this, together to take those cases that are provable and to bring them through the system.
Okay, thank you very much.